At 4:32 a.m., downtown Minneapolis looked like a city holding its breath. A thin sheet of freezing mist hung over the streets. Neon from late-night bars bled into wet pavement. Delivery trucks sat parked in silence. Traffic lights changed for no one. Somewhere in the distance, a siren rose and fell, then vanished into the dark. And into that darkness came the strike teams. FBI, ICEDEA, DHS tactical support. SWAT teams stacked in black armor, faces hidden behind visors, rifles angled low as engines died 1 block away from the first target. In another part of the city, armored vehicles rolled up behind a shuttered karaoke lounge investigators believed was laundering cartel money through fake liquor sales and underground gambling. In St. Paul, another team moved toward a supposed import-export office that was, in truth, a dispatch node for narcotics shipments masked as refrigerated produce runs. South of the metro, in a warehouse belt near Burnsville, agents surrounded a distribution hub hidden behind the front of a commercial cleaning supplier. In Shakopee, they hit a trucking yard tied to shell companies with names so bland they vanished in plain sight. In Mankato, a rural safe house used for packaging methamphetamine and fentanyl pills was taken from 3 sides before anyone inside realized the perimeter had closed. The timing was exact. The rhythm was brutal. Breaching charges flashed against steel doors. Glass shattered inward. Flashbangs punched light into black rooms. Agents moved like shadows through fog and neon, barking commands that cut through the silence like blades. One suspect ran through the rear exit of a warehouse carrying a duffel bag, so heavy he stumbled before he reached the fence. Another tried to torch a ledger room and died coughing on chemical smoke before he got the lighter to catch. In one basement casino, hidden beneath a boarded-up family restaurant, agents found tables still warm, cards still scattered, and a back room stacked with vacuum-sealed bundles of currency beside ledgers written in code. In a converted auto garage, they found hydraulic traps in the concrete floor leading to a concealed fentanyl press room. In a strip mall massage front, they uncovered forged IDs, false passports, debt logs, and transit schedules investigators believed were tied to human trafficking and migrant smuggling routes, moving through the Midwest under the protection of the same network. And the drugs kept coming. 42 kilos of fentanyl powder in one site, nearly 1.9 million fentanyl pills spread across 4 raid locations, more than 380 kilos of methamphetamine, some crystal, some pressed into transport bricks, 176 kilos of cocaine hidden inside food-grade plastic drums, 58 kilos of heroin packed in machine parts, enough narcotics, according to the fictional estimate in this story, to flood streets across multiple states for months, enough to poison neighborhoods that would never know where the shipment began, only where it ended. Cash was everywhere, inside walls, under floorboards, in freezer compartments, in nursery furniture, in the hollowed shells of industrial generators. By sunrise, just the physical currency counted on scene had passed $31 million. And the digital seizure team was still tracing crypto wallets, offshore transfers, and account clusters tied to transportation firms, sham charities, consulting groups, and real estate holdings. But it was not the money that made the case feel different. It was what they found in a sub-basement beneath a distribution warehouse near the river. 3 encrypted server racks, 6 hardened laptops in steel cases, 12 external drives wrapped in anti-static sleeves, a sealed box of burner phones labeled only by dates, and, locked behind a false wall, 4 steel containers holding contracts, procurement records, campaign donation maps, and access schedules for state transport checkpoints. One of the agents on scene reportedly looked at the documents, then looked back at the evidence team and said the line nobody in the room wanted to hear. "This doesn't smell like protection," he said. "This smells like management." By 9:16 a.m., the scene had shifted to a federal cyber forensics lab lit by screens and fluorescent fatigue. Outside, the winter sun over St. Paul looked pale and harmless. Inside, analysts were feeding seized drives through decryption rigs and reconstructing file systems sector by sector, watching broken fragments become a map. Not a simple map, a living one. Layers of routes, payments, aliases, shell entities, trucking paths, warehouse swaps, prepaid device pings, encrypted message chains, and coded directives all converging into one internal project name. Project Winter Lantern. That was the architecture behind the network in this fictional story. Project Winter Lantern was not just a trafficking operation. It was a Midwest logistics machine built to turn distance, weather, and respectability into camouflage. Analysts found ghost corporations registered in Delaware, freight brokers in Iowa, nonprofit recovery foundations in Minnesota, restaurant chains used to skim cash, cold storage firms near Owatonna, logistics consultancies in St. Paul, and a green energy transport initiative that existed mostly on paper but somehow received public-facing grants and private capital injections. Payments moved in disguised layers, small invoices, equipment maintenance reimbursements, route optimization contracts, fuel hedges, freight insurance adjustments. Beneath them sat a river of dirty money. It flowed through Mexico, Arizona, Texas, Illinois, Minnesota, and then out again into the Dakotas, Wisconsin, Michigan, Ohio, and beyond. And then the analysts found the signature. Not a handwritten signature. Not some dramatic note left behind like a movie villain. Something colder. A cryptographic authorization key tied to emergency route changes, checkpoint bypass approvals, law enforcement watch list scrubs, and distribution timing updates. Again and again, the same signature appeared inside Winter Lantern traffic. It approved convoy movement. It flagged safe roads. It froze inspections. It reassigned freight scans. It authorized facility swaps hours before raids on rival crews. It appeared in ledgers tied to narcotics loads, migrant smuggling payments, tunnel engineering plans in the Southwest, and payoff schedules to local fixers in the Midwest. The key was linked to a man named Ronan Kessler. Publicly, in this fictional dramatization, Ronan Kessler was a polished, state-level logistics magnate, political donor, infrastructure consultant, and trusted behind-the-scenes fixer known for getting procurement problems solved and stalled projects moving again. He wore expensive winter coats, funded civic redevelopment panels, sat on trade boards, and spoke in the clean, bloodless language of efficiency. Privately, according to the files opening in that lab, he was the hinge, the broker, the quiet architect who took a Sinaloa-linked trafficking pipeline and turned Minnesota's distribution web into a cold-weather shield for a growing drug empire. You could call it corruption if you wanted. But one analyst, staring at transaction links spreading across her screen like veins, said it more clearly. "This is not corruption," she whispered. "This is command-level collusion. And worse still, the network was not reactive. It was designed. Warehouses were chosen for traffic insulation and zoning blind spots. Truck fleets were rotated through legitimate agricultural and consumer goods routes so the suspicious loads could disappear among ordinary commerce. Stash houses were placed near freeway splits for rapid route changes. Laundering fronts were kept boring on purpose. No gold chains. No music videos. No obvious kingpins posing by supercars. Just barcode scanners, balance sheets, freight software, warehouse badges, and enough fear to keep everyone below the top obedient." Then came the file that made the room go silent. It was labeled Continuity Tier. Inside were contingency plans for arrests, media management, backup routes, replacement crews, payroll protection, a political shielding, and a list of compromised insiders categorized by usefulness. Patrol influence, inspection suppression, financial laundering, judicial delay, records access, election channeling, nothing flashy. Just a shadow administration built to keep the machine alive no matter who got caught. And that was the moment the federal command staff understood something grim. The morning raids had not ended the operation. They had only knocked on the outer wall. At 3:58 a.m. the following day, inside a hardened command center outside St. Paul, a digital map of the region pulsed with red markers like open wounds. Minneapolis, St. Paul, Eagan, Burnsville, Shakopee, Rochester, Albert Lee, Mankato, St. Cloud, Duluth, Moorhead, small logistics parks near interstate junctions, quiet residential blocks used as stash houses, or corporate storage yards, farm outbuildings rented under false names, finance offices, freight relay points, private hangars. Secondary nodes blinked across Iowa, Wisconsin, and Illinois. This was no street gang. It was a disciplined regional system tied to a larger Mexican cartel pipeline and protected by men who understood not just violence, but administration. The mission order went out before dawn. More than 1,100 federal personnel, 43 tactical teams, financial crimes units, cyber recovery crews, ICE transport interdiction groups, DEA evidence teams, DHS aviation support, armored vehicles staged at 12 locations, search warrants stacked like bricks, medical personnel on standby, drone overwatch in selected corridors. Intercept teams placed along interstate lanes in case the network tried to scatter assets before the hammer dropped. And then, all at once, Tsatsrain Brishti Tatusilidi. It did. Near Rochester, agents hit a climate-controlled warehouse disguised as a pharmaceutical storage annex and found industrial shelving lined with narcotics packaged inside sealed equipment casings. South of Albert Lea, a convoy of 2 box trucks and an escort SUV tried to break north after a spotter flagged unusual radio traffic. They made it 11 miles before federal vehicles boxed them in near a way station that, investigators later learned, had mysteriously gone offline for maintenance during earlier cartel runs. In Duluth, officers raided a shipping intermediary connected to manipulated manifests and hidden maritime transfers through Great Lakes routes. In St. Cloud, a mansion with lakefront views and imported stone walls turned out to be less a home than a fortified command post, complete with surveillance feeds, encrypted communications, and hidden compartments loaded with rifles, suppressors, body armor, and stacks of cash sealed in dry bags. In a rural property outside Mankato, investigators uncovered a modified machine shed concealing a methamphetamine conversion lab, backup power systems, and radio repeaters linked to drivers on interstate corridors. Across the Twin Cities metro, cartel-run bars, pseudo-charities, transport offices, and cash collection fronts were hit so fast, their internal networks never had time to stabilize. One building in St. Paul had 3 businesses registered to the same address: a tax prep office, a church outreach nonprofit, and a freight mediation service. Behind a locked interior wall, agents found currency counters, migrant smuggling ledgers, prepaid device inventories, and route diagrams cross-referencing pickups in Arizona and transfers through Kansas City before final movement into Minnesota. The seizures climbed fast. More narcotics, more firearms, more vehicles, more crypto wallets, more server farms, more communication hubs, more hard-copy payroll books listing aliases beside badge numbers and courthouse contacts. A vault in one suburban property held passports, judicial filing templates, property deeds, and blackmail material on public employees. Another contained vacuum-sealed cash bricks stacked so tightly the evidence team had to count them in shifts. By noon, the underworld in this fictional Minnesota had taken more damage in 6 hours than it had in the previous 6 years. But the ugliest part was still ahead, because once the servers were imaged and the communications logs reconstructed, investigators stopped looking only at cartel members. They started looking at uniforms, official inboxes, access logs, patrol assignments, internal route bulletins, dispatch records, maintenance schedules, judicial continuances, licensing exceptions, administrative anomalies that, taken alone, looked like clerical noise. Taken together, they formed a second map. The cartel had not simply bribed a few desperate cops. It had cultivated a parallel enforcement system. 19 local law enforcement personnel, according to the fictional evidence in this story, had taken money, gifts, debt relief, or family protection deals. 4 county-level administrators had manipulated records or procurement channels. 2 deputy chiefs had quietly redirected task force attention away from priority corridors at critical moments. 3 courthouse clerks delayed warrant processing tied to certain addresses. 1 transit-compliant supervisor repeatedly flagged key freight lanes as low risk despite intelligence suggesting the opposite. A retired judge, brought in as a consultant to a transport board, used influence to stall oversight reviews. Several civilian contractors tied to state logistics systems provided infrastructure data that should never have left secured channels, and the method was chillingly simple. Border relaxations were timed elsewhere in the country to smooth inbound loads. Patrol grids in the Midwest were softened on certain nights. Drug convoys were routed through low-friction corridors during weather events, public protests, sporting weekends, or maintenance shutdowns. Inspection software tagged suspect shipments as previously cleared. Internal leaks warned the network when raids were coming. Honest officers were sent chasing noise while real cargo rolled past in plain sight. One veteran investigator reportedly sat in front of a wall of printed emails, badge rosters, and payment chains, then pushed his chair back and covered his face with both hands. He had spent 23 years believing that infiltration looked like a dirty cop in a parking lot taking an envelope. But this was payroll, scheduling, systems design, quiet signatures inside procedural language. It was a bureaucracy with a cartel heartbeat. And when federal arrest teams moved on the insiders, the emotional damage cut deeper than the gun cases or the narcotics piles. A senior sergeant was taken from his driveway while neighbors watched through blinds. A deputy chief was arrested walking into a civic breakfast where he was supposed to speak about public safety partnerships. A legislative aide broke down the moment agents read the conspiracy counts aloud. One county planner tried to insist he had only approved roadwork shifts and routing exceptions, nothing more. Until investigators placed before him transfer records showing cartel funds paying his brother's medical debts and his daughter's tuition. The honest officers were the ones who looked wounded, not because they had been outplayed by criminals, because they had been betrayed by colleagues, by command staff, by people who wore the same uniforms, pinned on the same badges, attended the same funerals, shook the same hands, and then went home to cash money soaked in fentanyl deaths and human misery. This was not just infiltration, it was a second authority structure, a hidden police function. A parallel chain of protection serving a Sinaloa-linked trafficking network while pretending to serve the public. And that is when the federal lead in this fictional tale delivered the line that stayed with everyone who heard it. "The badge will survive," he said, "but this version of the system will not." Then the map got bigger, because as analysts widened the lens, Minnesota stopped looking like the destination and started looking like the hinge. Routes extended south through Arizona corridors, Texas handoff points, and warehouse relays near the border. Loads crossed through legitimate trucking contractors, mixed freight transfers, and agricultural shipments. Some moved under refrigeration, some inside machinery, some through fake energy equipment grants and infrastructure contracts that justified movement into industrial parks with minimal scrutiny. From Minnesota, distribution fanned outward through interstate corridors to Wisconsin, the Dakotas, Iowa, Illinois, and Michigan. Rail access, port links, trucking density, cold weather, and lower suspicion had all made the state ideal for what Ronan Kessler wanted to build, not a temporary stash point. A permanent cartel fortress disguised as a logistics state. Analysts found projections showing the network could move multiple tons of narcotics per week without triggering major alerts once Phase 3 of Winter Lantern was complete. Shipping manifests would be altered upstream. Way stations would be closed selectively for maintenance. Freight scans would be rerouted. Driver records would be padded with legitimate history. Human trafficking and migrant smuggling circuits would be used as cover noise. Their results were overwhelming limited enforcement capacity, while premium narcotics loads moved inside cleaner channels. The network even planned to expand into synthetic precursor storage and pill press dispersion across several counties so no single raid could cripple production. Then came the final catastrophic file, North Star Covenant. It read less like a criminal memo and more like a blueprint for shadow governance. Long-term campaign influence, regulatory capture, appointment pipelines, civic donations to buy moral cover, infrastructure leverage, housing acquisitions around critical freight lanes, nonprofit fronts to shape narratives and recruit desperate labor. But a 20-year vision not just for moving drugs, but for redesigning regional systems to protect the movement of drugs. In plain language, the goal was horrifying. The future had been drafted for the cartel before the public even knew a war was being fought. That is the realization that lingers in stories like this, even fictional ones. Not merely that criminal networks can infiltrate institutions, but that given enough money, enough patience, enough fear, and enough ambitious people willing to stay silent, they can begin redesigning the institution itself. By the time evening settled over the Twin Cities, the seizure board showed numbers too large to fit in a single frame. More than $200 million in combined assets and takedown value, 67 arrests, nearly 2 million fentanyl pills, hundreds of kilos of methamphetamine, cocaine, and heroin, weapons caches, encrypted servers, laundering ledgers, transport networks, corrupt insiders, human trafficking evidence, smuggling routes, payroll chains, property titles, proxy companies. And at the center of it, one polished fixer who thought freight schedules and political influence could hide the bones of a drug empire forever. Maybe that is the darkest part of this fictional story. Power does not always arrive with gunfire and screaming convoys. Sometimes power arrives in a pressed coat with a consultant's smile, a donor dinner, a transport grant, and a spreadsheet so clean it looks harmless. Sometimes it does not need open violence. Sometimes it only needs silence, ambition, and enough people willing to tell themselves they are not responsible for where the road leads. But the road always leads somewhere. It leads to overdoses in apartments where parents find children too late. It leads to fentanyl deaths filed as numbers until you remember every number had a name. It leads to neighborhoods hollowed out by cocaine, heroin, meth, and synthetic poison that moves faster than truth and cheaper than recovery. It leads to women trapped in trafficking pipelines, migrants treated like expendable cargo, officers forced to wonder which colleague sold them out, and families who never knew the man funding the local charity gala was also signing off on the route that brought death into their city. That is why stories like this matter, even when they are fictional, because the warning inside them is real. A democracy does not collapse only when enemies attack from outside. Sometimes it weakens when ambition from within decides that institutions are for sale, when organized crime stops thinking like a gang and starts thinking like a government, when criminal networks stop hiding in the shadows and start writing policy in the dark. If you're still listening, then you already understand this is bigger than one raid, one state, or one villain. It is about what happens when decent people assume someone else is watching the gates. It is about what grows in the silence between public trust and private greed. And it is about the terrible cost of waiting too long to look beneath what seems ordinary. So if this story held your attention, if this warning means something to you, tap like so more people see it. And if you want corruption dragged into the light, comment expose. Because whether the danger comes in the form of a drug cartel, a hidden trafficking pipeline, a corrupt fixer, or a system too compromised to protect its own people, the first step is refusing to look away.